it's where the data took me. It's like, if this is it, I need to know. I mean, why would I discount it just because it doesn't fit into my reality? That's a ridiculous way to do any kind of scholarship.
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here as your host speaking. I want to remind everybody before we get going here, please subscribe, please share if you want, also rate. We're having wonderful discussions with people all around the world. Our regular listeners already know that, and we're continuing to do so. Today's latest edition of one of the profound subjects, or some of the profound subjects that we already deal with on the podcast. So we're excited about it. And before we get to that, as also our regular listeners know, we are also a charity. So everything we do, we give our time here. Any donations that we receive go directly to the production of the podcast itself. We're just a bunch of people who like to discuss the what ifs, the why nots, and truth. So here we go. So today we're joined. I didn't ask you. You're in the Carolinas right now. You're in North Carolina right now, right?
I'm in North Carolina.
Okay. That voice belongs to Diana Walsh Pasulka. She's a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Her research examines miraculous events within Catholic history to new religious movements. Recent books include American Cosmic, Religion, UFOs and Technology, and Encounters, AI, UFOs, Religion. She is widely published, recently in Tank, Vox, Vice, and is a featured speaker at conferences, podcasts, radio, and television. Memorable engagements include the Guggenheim Museum in New York, a keynote speech at Rice University, amongst others. And she is also a lead investigator on an ongoing study of Catholic manuscripts about saints, levitation, and bilocation in partnership with the Vatican Secret Archive. Diana, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
This is really exciting. I mean, you know this already ad nauseum almost. I've been telling you that, or I had been telling you that I read your book over a 5-day vacation south of your border in Mexico.
That's right.
I think I was the only guy on the beach in like a 100-mile radius that brought a pen to the beach. So, taking a lot of notes. So I'm not sure if I did tell you the first time we spoke. Your name came up after one of our conversations about a year and a half ago with one of our guests, and they said you have to speak to Diana Pasulka. I said, okay, well, let's look her up. And we made note, and then another guest asked us the same thing. You should suggested that we do the same. And then Jeffrey Kripal, who we had on the podcast this summer, about 6 months ago, urged us to reach out to you. So we did. And I'm glad we did. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of themes that we've been discussing on podcasts here and there and everywhere with folks, with scientists, with artists that touch upon a lot of the things that you have been studying for many years and that you put into your book, American Cosmic. Let's start off very quickly. Why did you call your book American Cosmic, Religion, UFOs and Technology?
Okay, so the book is about, well, it began as a book about how UFOs are an example of how we, with our engagement with technology and especially entertainment technology, form ideas about the transcendent and the sacred and basically UFOs. I thought, we don't have a lot of evidence for UFOs. Why would so many people believe in them? And my idea was that it would be because of entertainment media, growing up with, Star Trek, Star Wars, X-Files, this kind of thing. And I was right, but it became something much more different, or much different than that. And so American Cosmic is a reference to the Russian cosmists. And there's a book by, I think his name, his last name is Young, and he's a professor of Russian history. and his book is called The Russian Cosmists. And he basically looks at the belief systems of the people who start the Russian space program, like Konstantin Tchaikovsky. And as I was doing my research, of course, I'm going to look at the historical records for our own space program. And of course, it led me to the other viable space program, which was the Russian space program. So it became apparent to me that we also have this spirituality that's also linked to evolution, and it like looks up at the stars, and it's a cosmism. It's called the cosmic or the cosmist ideology or spirituality. And so I just thought, well, I'm doing American cosmic. So whereas he did the Russian cosmists, I was doing the American version.
Well, this is so there are lots of things that are fascinating with your project and your research that went into this book, I find, based on what you've told me and based on the description that you gave in the book. And by the way, when I was reading it, I felt like I was really into Indiana Jones when I was a preteen, like I was 11, 12 years old. And I used to save up money to buy the Choose Your Own Adventure books. I don't know if you remember those. And there are lots of Indiana Jones. There's like 4 or 5 that I used to read. I would read every ending. I wasn't happy with just reading the one, choosing the right adventure. But it felt like that. The way you were writing, at least in the first half, it felt like an adventure that you were on. For me, that was fascinating because even though this is an academic book, and that you spent how many years? 6 years of research. It actually reads like a wonderful, real story.
Yes, that wasn't intentional either. Basically, it was such an unusual set of circumstances that it became my story. Actually, it became me following these scientists and the people that I met. I was just basically keeping up with the scientists and the people who I met on this journey. I was surprised basically by what I was learning. I did not know that our government was in this, was basically studying UFOs, and I didn't know at what level. And I met people that I never had thought I would meet. And so I was just trying to keep up with it. And then my regular research is doing Catholic history. So I was set to go to the Vatican, and I realized that Tyler should actually go with me to the Vatican because he could give, put a set of eyes on these documents that he could actually that he'd never seen before. It wasn't his tradition, but he could give me some information on them that might be helpful. So I invited him to go. So we both went to the Vatican. My book had already been turned into the editor, but that going to the Vatican with this scientist who was part of the space program, that had to go in the book. That had to be the last chapter in the book. So I came back and I told my editor, and I took a picture of Brother Guy Consolmagno, he with his telescope, and I sent it to her. And I said, "Do you like this picture?" And she said, "It's beautiful. I love it." And I said, "Then let me put another chapter in the book." And she said, "Okay."
Wonderful.
That's how it stopped. Basically, that was the ending, but it was really not an ending.
Well, yeah, right. So part of me was, so the human part of me was disappointed because there was no conclusion, right? But I think that's part of the lesson.
It is.
The questions keep being asked. We had Brother Guy here on the podcast, regular listeners, and I didn't know that you were friends with Brother Guy, and that you had known him when I reached out to him. It was wonderful to read about him after we had recorded a session in your book. That was a treat. I want to get back to that later because for the listener who hasn't read your book, your intention was never to write anything like this about UFOs at all.
No.
Can you give us a little bit of the backstory and how this all started 2012?
Yes, this is the backstory. So I'm a professor of the Christian tradition, and I look at miracles and historical events that people then interpret to be miracles in the historical record. And I write about that. And I've written about relics and, Catholic things that Protestants somewhat don't understand. And, so I've been doing this, and I'm, at the time that I began this project, I was a full professor and chair of my department. And I just finished a book on purgatory, which is the belief in, it's an afterlife destination in Catholic and Orthodox Christianity for souls that don't quite make it to heaven, and they go to this place, this in-between place. Mm-hmm. And then once they suffer enough, then they get into heaven. So I did a book about that. And as I was doing the research for that book, I found that there were a lot of reports of aerial phenomena in the historical record. And I kept a big log of that. Every time I came across one, I thought, this is strange. And I would write it down. So I ended up with this big log of these historical events.
How far back? Historical events? What do you mean? How far back did they go?
1200. I was researching things from 1100 to 1200, just prior to Dante's Inferno and things like that. Incredible. And the Divine Comedy. And, a lot of it was in medieval French. There were a lot of languages that I had to decipher. It took me a long time to do. And so I had this record of aerial phenomena. And honestly, UFOs never crossed my mind about those. I just thought that I didn't actually know what to think of them. And one of them actually made it into the Purgatory book. And it was about this nun from the 1800s in France. And this light, this orb thing would come through her cell at night. She lived in this convent. And she would go to the head of the convent, who was a priest, and she'd say that this was, it was terrifying to her. And no one believed her. This was this young nun. And she was so persistent that finally the Mother Superior said, I'll come and I'll sit with you at night and I'll see what's going on. So she did, and she saw it too. So it came in and it hovered around them and it scared them both. And they determined that it was a soul from purgatory and that it needed to be prayed back to purgatory. So the whole community then prayed that this thing would go away. All right. So it would be things like that, not just that, but things that would come through the atmosphere, like a big star, and then there would be like a face in the star, and it would have some kind of communication with people and then go back up, or, sometimes beams would come down. And so I made this list. And when I was finished with my book on purgatory and it was, at the press, I turned my attention to the next project, which was going to be a project about John England, who's a bishop, the first bishop in the Americas. He was here in the Carolinas. And I was having coffee with my friend and I showed this to him and I said, what do you think of this stuff? And he took his time, and he looked it over and he looked up at me. And the first thing he said was, Steven Spielberg. And I was like, what? And he said, this looks like UFOs. And I was mad. I was like, get it out. You are so wrong. And he said, no, Diana, it really does. It looks like UFOs.
You felt sorry to interrupt. You felt like that was devaluing your work? Is that why?
No, I just thought he was crazy. I thought it never occurred to me the parallels between aerial phenomena historically and current aerial phenomena. I mean, I'd seen, like everyone, some episodes of Ancient Aliens and such, but it never struck me to actually look into anything like this. I just thought that I honestly was not a believer.
Well, case in point, because I also learned there's a story you recounted in another interview that your brother encountered an orb when he was small, when he was young.
Yes.
And that became the talk of the family as well. It
did for that day. And then we somehow all promptly forgot about it. And I didn't even remember it until I started to do this research.
Is that interesting?
And that's another pattern, which is very strange. So there was coincidentally, after I talked to my friend about my research in the aerial phenomena, there was a conference, a UFO conference here in my town, and I signed up to go. And that's where I met Chris Bledsoe, and he gave a presentation about his experience. And I also met a lot of other people who had experiences. And I realized that my friend was actually making sense, that, wow, what people had been talking about in the historical record is still happening. And is it just that they're seeing drones in the sky, and what's their interpretive framework today? And so that's how I began the research. I said, this is definitely viable to do as a project. I'll do it. I have all this data, and I'll just get some more data, and I'll do a comparative analysis of stuff from back in the day, in Europe and whatnot, to American frameworks for understanding aerial phenomena. And that's how I started my book. So I immediately met a lot of people that I thought I would never meet. And they turned out to be people like Dr. Gary Nolan, who at the time, he was Dr. Gary Nolan. But for my book, we used pseudonyms because this was prior to the government's admission that they were studying this phenomenon, which happened in June of 2021. And so this was, 2015, 2016. And, we go to New Mexico with this man named Tyler, who's affiliated with so many different government agencies that is, to me, somewhat frightening. So it took me about 1.5 years to actually meet him in person. So that's why the research took so long, was because I was just not comfortable with the people that I was meeting. I mean, they were fine people. They were completely okay. But my whole epistemology of life was radically shifting. My idea about my government, my idea about the reality of aerial phenomena, everything was changing. And that takes time. So it took me a while to get used to the realities, and the realities just kept getting weirder and weirder and weirder. And so I was like constantly in this state of readjusting my understanding. And, I'm a mom. I have young kids at that time, and still really. And, I was the chair of a department. I have students. So it was a pretty wild journey.
Well, I can imagine. I mean, that's another dimension that we never talk about. When I say we, I mean, society doesn't typically talk about. You're responsible to a lot of people, right? You have a large family. So
yeah. Yes.
And you have students, and you have a career, and you have your research, and you have a life that you've invested into. But you're also, I'm going to put words in your mouth, you're also curious about things you don't know. And that was bringing you somewhere that you didn't expect. And you weren't not going to pursue that. I mean, I didn't even need to speak to you to know that, but you get that from reading the book.
Yes. I mean, it's where the data took me. It's like, if this is it, I need to know. I mean, why would I discount it just because it doesn't fit into my reality? That's a ridiculous way to do any kind of scholarship.
There's a quote in your book. I forgot what. Oh no! Look at that! I opened it right at the quote. Holy cow, I was gonna say I don't know where. And who were we talking about here? Gary Nolan, I think, who was James in your book.
Yes.
And I linked it to something. It was something fun, something light, but maybe not light. We had on the podcast a few weeks ago. She is one of the, and just by chance, because she was curious and she went there, but she's a psychologist and a marine scientist by trade, but she got involved with octopuses and the consciousness of octopuses, and she just decided to research that, and she's become a world expert, just like by chance. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm a world expert in octopuses. And she was on My Octopus Teacher. She was the on Netflix. Oh,
that's right. Yes, she's amazing.
Well, she was the scientist on board advising on octopuses. But anyway, she said, and we had her on a podcast, and she did say, and she shared that octopuses are one of the few animals that we know that doesn't like not knowing. So they need to understand things. And then we talked about how the octopus might have a concept of past and future as well. So she went through some of those things. But then I think it was Gary here who said it. And he says, humans don't like to admit to themselves that they can't figure things out. So we tend to be pretty arrogant about our abilities.
Yep.
And that's what I was alluding to as well when I said, there's no ending to your book. There's no clean finish to your book. And that's the human being inside of me that wants things figured out so I can move on.
Right. Yes. It would be nice to put an end to that story.
Well, let me link it to something else you told me when we first had a discussion that as a student, actually, and I don't know as a prof, I didn't ask you about it as a prof, but as a student, you said that you didn't like tests and examinations because that wasn't the way to work. And
right.
And you gave an example about an art teacher. Sorry, I'm going a little bit off tangent, but I'm not.
Yeah. So I've had some amazing teachers who probably don't know that they were my teachers, but they were. And of course, I didn't know at the time. That's just how it works, I guess. You only know it years later, and you're like, wow, I really learned a lot from that person. But this teacher was a visiting teacher at the University of California, Davis, where I was an undergraduate. And I just happened to take an art class. And he decided that he was going to teach us how to draw. So what he did was he took this he just picked up this piece of paper and he smashed it up into his hands. He crumpled it up and he threw it on the table. There were probably about 30 of us. We were all sitting around this table looking at this paper from different vantage points. And he said, draw that. So we all set about drawing that. Now, why did he do that? He wanted to break through our conceptions of what things were, because what we don't actually just have, what does a crumpled piece of paper look like? Well, you have to actually look at it in order to make that drawing. So it was I would call it a Zen Buddhist move, where he's trying to get past our conceptions of what things are. Because, if he says, here, draw this man or draw this woman, you'll draw what your brain tells you a man or a woman is, but you won't draw what's in front of you. So he was trying to get us to draw what was directly in front of us. Another art teacher would turn things upside down and say, draw this. So again, it would trick your brain into drawing what is in front of you. So we tend not to experience life that way. We tend to have conceptions that we experience life through. And that's what these practices do. They're attempting to break you out of those conceptions so that you actually interface with what's directly in front of you.
That's also why I was grateful for having the opportunity to speak to you, to learn about that particular instance in your life, because that rang for me. And especially when I was reading through your book, I always had that kind of hovering in the clouds somewhere. You like what I did there? You like what I did? Because your beliefs could potentially be shattered at any moment during your data collection, during any conversation that you had, anything that you witnessed, anything that you read. And then looping this back to 7 minutes ago in our conversation about invisible and visible college. What did you find? What did you see? And what do you mean by that? Invisible college?
Sure. So if you start to do any kind of study into American UFOs, you come across a group of scientists called the Invisible College. And this was started by Alan Hynek, who had been in Air Force, worked with the United States Air Force. He's an astronomer. He has a PhD in astronomy. I think he's astrophysicist, but I could be wrong. One or the other, or maybe even both. And he worked with the Air Force for a program which was secret at the time called Project Blue Book, believed from 1952 to 1969. And so he coined the term the Invisible College. And well, he didn't actually coin that term. He repurposed it. It was in reference to a group of scientists in the early modern time period in Europe who had to hide their identities because they were doing science. And doing science at the time was very dangerous. People could get killed or put on house arrest for their whole lives, right? Like Galileo or something like that. Mm-hmm. So they called themselves the Invisible College and they worked together. They were also, by the way, Rosicrucians. They were also part of an esoteric group of people. They didn't really separate religion or their spirituality from their science. In fact, they thought it was similar or the same even. And so Alan Hynek repurposed this term for himself. Jacques Vallée, who is a very famous ufology or I call him a researcher. He has a PhD from Northwestern in information science from the 1960s. I mean, it was like very beginning of the, the creation of the kind of techno environment in which we live. Jacques was like one of the people who instigated or initiated that, or architected it, what you can call, I don't mean to use it as a verb, but there you go.
Including the precursor to the internet. So,
that's right.
He's prominent in your book.
ARPANET. Yeah, ARPANET. So, okay. So that's what the Invisible College is and was. And I met most of the people in the Invisible College and worked with several of them. But what I found out was that the people who were actually most interfacing with the phenomena today were part of something entirely different than the Invisible College. So the Invisible College still knew of each other and worked together. And, they weren't really so invisible either, because Jacques Vallée wrote about them in the 1970s in a book called The Invisible College. So, but there were truly invisibles, people, what I called invisibles, people who worked so secretly that their bosses did not know what they did. And they were so compartmentalized that they did not even talk to each other about what they did. And this reminded me of the book and movie called Fight Club. So I called this the UFO Fight Club. So the next generation Invisible College was this UFO Fight Club. And I met people who in the UFO Fight Club, and they didn't even know each other. And they were quite amazing people. So this was my new research environment, was people like this. They had clearances, various levels of top secret, kind of crazy, but real life, really.
And that's including Tyler D in your book, named after.
Yeah, I called him Tyler D after Tyler Durden from the Fight Club series.
Well, not to give too much away from your book, but at one point, the two of you, as you have mentioned a few minutes ago, the two of you were going to be were traveling to the Vatican, but he left first and he arrived there before you.
Yes.
And you want to tell that story? What transpired there at the Vatican Archives?
Crazy. Yeah. So, well, he had actually. So the story begins in New Mexico and it ends at the Vatican. So it's two places where kind of ground zero of belief for two different types of religions. For one, the cosmist religion, which I'm writing about, and two, the Vatican, right, which is of course a major place of the beginnings of religion for the West. So, I mean, these are two very iconic places to begin and end a book about religion and technology. And I'm talking about a new type of religion. And by the way, this new type of religion is actually taking off right now with the chat GPT and AI, and the new prompt Dan and things like that. I mean, it's just amazing to see. And it gets, it's being corroborated even by Elon Musk. So what I predicted would happen is absolutely happening.
It's happening
right before our eyes. So anyway, so Tyler D is this person who I don't want to meet right away when I first become aware that he wants to meet me, actually. And he wanted to meet me because he said that he's been a space shuttle mission controller his whole career. So he starts so that program's it's currently not running, but it ran for many, many, many years. And he was a part of the whole thing. And he's a mission controller and still is, to my knowledge. And he's involved. He calls the study of UFOs, at that time, he called it his hobby. Okay. Mm-hmm. So he said that he wanted to meet me because he knew that I had a lot of data about historical phenomena, and that this would actually help him because he was involved in creating technologies that he said were inspired by his belief in, he called it off-planet phenomena. So off-planet phenomena. So he also had some affiliations to some agencies, like 3-letter agencies. I don't know exactly what they were, but I do know that I didn't want any involvement with that.
Sure.
So I put off meeting him. I finally did meet him after about a year and a half, and he turned out to be completely nice, kind of normal type of person, other than the fact that he does this work, right? And so he said that. So when we went to New Mexico, he said that he didn't think I believed in UFOs and that I needed to have physical proof. He wanted me to see physical proof. So that is why we went there. But when we went to the Vatican, it's not easy to get into the secret archive. So you have to have special credentials. I happen to have those credentials. And he didn't have those. And there was no way he was going to be let in my opinion. But, he just was very confident that somehow he was going to get in. And so we agreed that we would go. And this is terrible. I do fly a lot, but I have to admit that I have a phobia of flying. I do not like to fly. So going to the Vatican was really going to be difficult for me. So we took different flights. So he got to the Vatican before me. And in fact, while I was en route to the Vatican, we were texting. And he said, here I am. They won't let me in, right? So there were 3 checkpoints to get into the secret archive. And he had a letter from a bishop. He had a letter from somebody in his space program and from the dean of a university. And he had a letter from me, but they weren't going to let him in. So they didn't let him in. And he kept asking me, should I show my card, And I kept thinking, no, if you show your card, they're going to know why we're there. And we won't be able to access any of the materials. And that's why we're going. So I kept saying, no, you shouldn't. Well, he couldn't. So it was hours, it takes about, 15 hours to get there from where I live. So as I'm going over the ocean, he's sending me updates. And it's been a couple of hours. And he says, I'm not going to be able to get in. And I said, all right, I guess go ahead. So he took out his card, showed it to the gentleman. He dropped something on the ground. And when he dropped something on the ground, he looked up and he happened to see his face come up on their computer. And he realized that they had him in their system and he got in. Not only did he get in, we had access to the point that I wouldn't have had access. I mean, we had our own priest to show us around and, to bring us to the different places in the Vatican to meet people that I would not have met had he not been who he is. And so it was one of those things.
Amazing. You said that they called you the lady doctor.
Yes. The Vatican was such a different experience for him than it was for me because, it's a big place where men are,
yeah, right.
and here I am. And so I'm the lady professor something.
Professoressa.
Yeah, that's right. And they would always look at him. So we would go up to get the items, which, by the way, I had given them 6 months ahead of time. I said, these are the things that we need because they have miles and miles of these manuscripts. So it takes them a long time to find them. And so you have to give them, a long time to get those. And so we would go up there and I'd say, this is what we're looking for. And I bring him with me because we would get better, service when they would look at him and say, this is what you need. And he felt like saying, ask her. She's the doctor. But they would bring it, he would take it back and we'd look at it. And I would say, okay, I think this is what it says, because it was a combination of Latin and 17th century Italian. It was pretty impenetrable. So we had to actually digitize those, which again was really a difficult thing to do, and to hire people. And there aren't very many of those people in the world who know that combination. So, so there's a huge digitization project going on right now at the Vatican to get all of that stuff before those languages are gone forever. And we just, maybe AI will figure out how to read them now that it's here.
Let's back up a little bit. So you mentioned Blue Book. For the listeners, this is like my 16-word summary of Blue Book. Involved in Project Blue Book was an intentional disinformation program by the military establishment to the general public about what they were studying, which is what we call UFOs. more or less?
Yeah, I mean, that was part of it. That was one goal. They wanted to take the public eye off of the topic so they could figure out what it was and
Right.
study it.
But thereby also creating it or contributing to create a culture of ridicule for anybody of the general public who is interested in studying it, or perhaps even experience things that they were studying covertly. Does that make sense?
And it was very successful in doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And my heart goes out to people who actually experienced something authentic and then were shunned by society for sharing.
And the scientists who, I think Bob McDonald, I believe that's his first name, and the scientists who were actually amazing researchers who either lost their jobs or were completely ridiculed to the point of depression.
Well, this is where I learned about John Mack. So speaking of which, right?
That's right. That's right. So yeah, Blue Book did its job. I don't know why they're the heroes now. Funny how that works.
And I agree with that. And that's based on what I've been learning, what I've been uncovering. Thanks to people like social scientists like you who have been unafraid to uncover things. That's what my next question is. Well, you were going through this. This is of course, it's pre 2021 when government actually admitted to the public that they were studying this, but pre 2017, which is when the New York Times article came out. So we've had Leslie Kane here. We've had Abby Loeb as well on the podcast who came out in 2007. Leslie Kane obviously contributed to writing that heavily. But you were doing this years prior.
Yes. And it was amazing. The timing was amazing for me.
Well, you said to me when we first spoke face to face that you wanted to make sure that our podcast wasn't a plant by an alphabet agency.
Yes.
So I assume you were also studying this and following your curiosities under some sort of shadow of danger. Can I say that? Or is that too heavy of a term?
Yeah, I felt it from the beginning, and which took me a long time, like I said, to get used to this type of people knowing what you're doing and paying attention to it, and then letting you know that they're paying attention to it. Every single one of us that's studying it has the same, like, Leslie has that. And then a lot of people, I think, are just being taken in, a lot of people who didn't study it before, but, there's now a lot of developments that are happening to shape the narrative of the encounters. And this is another thing that's fascinating to me because it happens in religions. When you see very powerful religions begin, and the first few hundred years, there's a dogmatization that happens. And sometimes that involves suppression of different ideas. And that's happening at a much faster rate today because of media. So we get, this is happening within instead of 300 years, it's happening in a year or 2 years. So here's an example. So I've written this next book that's coming out. And in the beginning of writing that book, I did a lot of research into Australia and a lot of the really interesting things that are happening in Australia from 1960s onward. And there was a lot out there, believe it or not, on the internet, a lot. And now I can't, so I knew where to look for those things, right? Because I'm a researcher. It's fairly easy to do that. So I went back to do the footnotes for the book and I couldn't find them. So we tend to think that, well, it's out there, right? It's in the, where is it? Where did it go? It's on the internet. It was on the internet. The internet is now saturated with what I call UFO industry entertainment kind of stuff. And the stuff that's linked to those encounters, it took me a lot longer to find. Let's put it that way. I couldn't even believe that I couldn't find it with the same keywords I used before. So the saturation of the media now with respect to UFOs and UAPs is pretty unbelievable. So so what we saw at the beginning of religion, say for Catholicism, which I said, a couple hundred years it took with some today, all they have to do is just take it off the internet, and people won't be exposed to it. That's how knowledge is being formed today. This is how the narratives work today.
Just making a connection, I guess dogma in the past, in the historical past, is what we see as control over the algorithm, what you're allowed to say.
Yeah, you're right. That's it.
In what we learned, so I grew up Catholic upbringing, more or less, and religious upbringing, even in school. We learned that the Catholic Church is what it is, and we learn about Council of Nicaea, like in 400, whatever it is. But we don't learn that Catholicism was really a disparate groups of former pagans or concurrent pagans who are practicing this new Christian faith. And there's lots of mysticism and real spirituality and ingestion. And this is what I've been learning through doing the podcast too, like with historians like Carl Rock, Jeffrey Kripal, that we've been learning. They were taking entheogens for hundreds of years, and the church finally stamped everything out and said, no, this is going to be the practice. A to Z, this is what we're doing. We're not doing outside of A to Z. And of course, 1500 years later, for us, this is the normal, so to speak. But it's really only a tight window to what humanity has experienced spiritually. We're told.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Christians actually, I'm in the South. And so I start any of my courses on, Christians. Let's do a section on Christianity. And it's basically learning about Christianity, because even if they went to Bible school, they actually didn't know there were 2 creation stories in Genesis. And, so basically it's unlearning and then relearning.
Unlearning. I think that's one thing that we're trying to do here subconsciously. We're trying to unlearn because there's so much. Well, okay, so let's go back then to you and your experience. So we can use the word danger, as we alluded to, as we used a few minutes ago. But also, I suspect that you were having difficulty with your colleagues as well, because you're a tenured professor, which is probably in a safe zone, like you were in a safe zone to do your research. But you had a lot of doubters. That's, I guess, a question. Number 2. Has that changed since your book came out?
Okay, so I didn't have any problems with colleagues. No one asked what I was doing, because I'd been doing what I'd been doing for so long and, being successful at it, that nobody really asked me what I was doing. And I had friends in my university, I have 2 in particular, who knew what I was doing, and they thought it was really interesting. And they were doing some form of it themselves, actually. So my university during the same time gave me my college's highest research award. So I was doing fine at my university. I did go to a few conferences where other people from other departments other than philosophy and religion, and they thought that I had been fooled somehow. Because I talked about James and Tyler, and I talked about the things that I learned and how, they viewed this and how it looks like the government studying it, or they have been, is what I had said. And they said, Diana, you've been fooled. And there's this saying in my field, which is that if somebody says that your research is interesting, that's basically, they don't like it.
That it's not interesting.
It's not. So I get a lot of interesting kind of thing. And I got this. And so I thought, okay, then the 2017 stuff with Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, the New York Times came out, and literally those same people called me the next day. So then, and it's just kind of continued along the lines that, and then a lot of people now really are kind of really want to study it now, because it's been legitimated by the government, which I think is kind of ironic, frankly, but yeah.
Isn't that interesting? The government, when we say government, so let's just use government, because I agree with you, I guess, in the big umbrella.
What's the Pentagon?
What's that?
You can make it specific.
The Pentagon.
Yeah,
the Pentagon. That's the holders, the modern day Vatican in North America.
Yeah, yeah.
um, so they've been forced to come out publicly, and it's been legitimized to use that word, quote unquote, but only because this is what frustrates me. Only because people like you, like researchers, who wanted to understand the basis of truth, spent years in the face of possible ridicule, in the face of, in your case, danger, and the unknown, committed to it. That's it. That's all. That's all like what we're finding here on the podcast too. That we want to speak to more and more people who are like that. It's like who say, no, the grain is what everybody else goes with. But how about we try something else?
Yeah. Yeah. And now what's going to happen is I'll predict it because they've come true, the predictions so far. So the prediction I have now is that the type of UFO that we're going to see people saying, this is it, this is it, this is the UFO, is going to be it's going to be the militarized UFO. So that the actual experience that people have of this phenomena is going to get completely swept under the carpet.
It's also been a little bit of an education for me in the last couple of years, is that, we say UFO, but UFO can mean a lot of things to many people. Like it can mean a physical object in the sky, or it could represent a spiritual opening or awakening or a portal to more knowledge. It's unfortunate that is the stigma. It's the flying machine in the sky. I haven't seen it, so it doesn't exist. That's gone on for so many decades. But that's what's going to be the sticking point to have people. I guess what you're saying, tell me if I'm off. That's going to be the new God that people are going to start praying to, legitimately.
Yes. Yeah, that's going to be the new idea of the sacred.
Right.
And
this
time it's even in the past, like Constantine was the one who created this Catholicism as a state religion. The context was war. So he thought that being a Christian would give him some advantage over war. So we can't really extract this military kind of idea from even the new sacred that we see.
It's the sense of conquering, or the sense of having a conqueror by your side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's God on our side. It's like the sacred's on our side. Like this advanced technology is now on our side. But the thing is that, listen, John Mack made a move in his career, and his life was cut short. Okay, so his career was this normal kind of researcher. Won his university's prestigious award, won the Pulitzer Prize. Okay, so for the research that he had done, not on UFOs, but with writing a personality profile of Lawrence of Arabia, who's a psychiatrist, John Mack. So he goes and he starts to study UFOs, and Harvard decides that this is probably not okay, and so they basically do a secret investigation. Then he has to fight back legally against his university. He wins. Okay. He writes this book about the population that he studied, which were having encounters with what they believed were non-human intelligence. They associated it with these things in the sky. So it became like the UFO. Okay. John Mack's next research move is to talk with people from indigenous communities all over the world. So he goes to Africa. He makes these contacts with people people from star nations, or these beings from star nations, are part of their ontologies. Okay. Indigenous ontologies. They've always been here. Okay. And so John Mack then writes Passport to the Cosmos, in reference, by the way, to Passport to Magonia, which is what Jacques Vallée's, the name of Jacques Vallée's book. So he's giving credit where credit is due, right? But he's also kind of extending this idea, and then he's cut short for, his life is cut short and he's not able to follow through. Well, in a sense, I'm not comparing myself to John Mack, but we are making the same movement in the sense that, I started out a disbeliever, and then I became a believer really in something that's happening. I don't know what it is though. So I'm agnostic about what it is. And then I realized, wait, you know, Indigenous people have talked about this forever. Like it makes a lot of sense to try to get them to talk to me. I want to know. So I asked them. And so I'm doing that right now. So a lot of that is in Encounters as well, which is the other book. Now that's probably not going to make the same impact as American Cosmic, which was a military, you know, I was looking at military people and military programs, because there's something about the power involved in that people are really drawn to. You know, if you look at, you know, the UFO communities right now, the people with the biggest platforms are the military people.
Yep. It hasn't aired yet. It's about to, but we had a recent interview with Ryan Graves, who was a Navy.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Navy pilot, so you know him. I mean, he's sticking to the line, and you know, I don't blame him because it's so damn relevant. Like we know pilots see things in the sky that do not have the same trajectory as the machines, which are the highest technologically capable machines that they know of, funded by the military. They have more capabilities than we could ever have that's humanly possible. They're there. People see them. We see them. We report them. Nothing's being done. And airline pilots, so we talked about that. Airline pilots see them too, but they're afraid to report it because if they report it, there's a high risk that they lose their job and their career. So meanwhile, like hundreds of thousands of people fly every day and things are being witnessed and we don't know what they are. And we choose to, or bodies choose to ignore them. Sorry, I mean, that's just a quick digression, but going back to indigenous spiritual beliefs, we've had a couple of indigenous elders, and one of them is a philosopher from Australia, actually, speaking of which. And we've talked about these beliefs, and there's something imputed in the discussion with them that came out in a discussion with a guy named Robert Doyle on this podcast, who's also a hypnotherapist. And there's something that feels right. And in reading your book, it feels more right. You see it because you believe it. So yeah, being open to the belief that something is around you, something exists outside of you, I think will open you up to the experience that you can have. I think it's just that simple. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm quoting Tyler in your book.
Okay.
I'm quoting Tyler, who you quoted in the book. So you're talking about the search for extraterrestrial life, and he says that humans are the preferred sensors.
Yeah.
And that was interesting. So that's why I made a note, one of my many notes here. SETI, which is the search for, so I'm quoting him now, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So SETI seems to look in all the wrong places with the wrong sensors. I guess any search is better than no search, but it won't come from a laser detector. The best detectors are humans like you and their net results, and maybe certain light frequencies or the study of physical relics. The wavelength of optical lasers is unlikely to find anything, but it sounds good and can obtain funding. So we are the sensors, which is, I think, what indigenous spiritualists have been saying for hundreds and hundreds of years, that we are the sensors.
That is absolutely true. And there are programs, in my opinion, I don't know this for a fact, that the government funds to study human sensors. That people that are just really good at it.
How has life changed for you now post 2012? Or 2012, excuse me.
Yeah. So I have a pre-UFO life and a post-UFO life. And I've just made some changes that needed to be made. And one of them is the people that I knew pre-UFO are trustworthy people. The people that I know post-UFO, most likely, if they're coming into my life, they're coming into my life because of my research. And generally, they'll want something. They'll want some information, data, I don't know, some kind of access. So I guess I'm a lot less outgoing than I used to be, which is fine. I mean, I'm a very busy person. So, and I have a lot of things that I do that really have nothing to do with UFOs. And so that's okay. But I guess also that, there seems to be an exponential feeling to life for me at the moment. And I think for everyone. And part of this is because of technology and the changes that are happening almost every day with it. I mean, my book, American Cosmic, was about technology and how technology impacts our beliefs about the sacred. So it's like that's what I look at. And I see that changing every single day.
So that's what you mean by exponential feeling.
Yeah, that is happening at an exponential rate now.
We've had two scientists from IONS on the podcast, Dean Reid and Helane Wabe. And IONS, we had them on because we learned about how IONS was founded. It was founded by Edgar Mitchell.
Yeah.
Obviously, for the listener's sake, he was an astronaut, 5th or 6th man to walk the moon. And the only thing I knew before I read your book was that he had a mystical experience. And that's the line that IONS gives, period. Nothing against Helane and Dean. They gave me the same line. It reads the same on the website. But then I read what he actually experienced. I was reading your book and my mind just went, like, talk about exponential, went, oh. It just blew open and done.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I read that too?
No, please do. It's beautiful.
So I'm reading an excerpt from your book, and these are his words. The biggest joy was on the way home. So when he was in the capsule, in my cockpit window, every 2 minutes, I saw the Earth, the moon, and the sun, and the whole 360-degree panorama of the heavens. And that was a powerful, overwhelming experience. And suddenly I realized that the molecules of my body and the molecules of the spacecraft and the molecules in the body of my partners were prototyped, manufactured in some ancient generation of stars. And that was an overwhelming sense of oneness and connectedness. It wasn't them and us. It was, that's me. It's all of it. It's one thing. And it was accompanied by an ecstasy, a sense, oh my God, wow, yes, an insight, an epiphany.
Yeah.
You should have that on the website.
Yes, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah.
We also learned, sorry, just a side note, we also learned that he was friends with Russell Targ. And of course, only learned that through your book. I don't want to give too much away, but there was remote viewing exercises done by Edgar with Russell Targ on the moon.
That's right. Yeah. What I began to find out when I was doing this research, it appeared as if almost so strangely, everyone was affiliated with each other in some way. That always seemed to lead back to SRI, Stanford Research Institute. And I'm like, what? And they didn't know each other, or, I would meet them and then I would figure it out. And I mean, it was just very strange,
I wonder how strange it really was, because I mean, you're from California. SRI is in California. There's a lot of different type of thinking that's been happening in California for many decades.
Yeah, especially in that area, the Bay Area.
So speaking then of California and creativity, you also told me when you were growing up, you took a lot of long walks in the forest as a kid. And that it's something I didn't follow up with a question, so I'm following up now. And you said you did art. So you said walking in the forest, and then you followed up by saying I did art. What does that mean?
Yeah. So when I look back, when I met Tyler and James and the people who were creating these amazing technologies that were game-changing technologies, that they would turn around and sell on the S&P 500 for a lot of money and, make patents. And they were involved in what I would call extreme creativity. And they did this because I I know about religion, and within religions, especially the traditional religions, you have these things called monastic traditions. So you've got these traditions within religions where people are basically focused on changing basically mysticism. And they do things to encourage a mystical union with their divinity. And these things tend to be the same. So they tend to be a form of like meditation or prayer, or being in nature, being away from other people, being in communities of people who do similar things, restricting your diet, maybe fasting. These were all similar types of things that these people did. And when I thought about it, so I recognized that they were also involved in doing science in certain ways. Like Gary Nolan, for example, would say that his graduate students a lot of times would ignore data that didn't fit what they thought it should fit, so they would ignore it. He would look at what they did and he'd bring them back to the thing that didn't fit. And he'd say, this thing, this anomaly, which you're ignoring, is what you need to be looking at to solve your problem. Okay. And so that's what creativity actually is. It's seeing what's there. So when I started to think about my own childhood, I started to recognize that I used to do things just normally that, well, they weren't normal things for kids to do, but they were normal for me. To these practices, I integrated them into my life. I don't know why. It almost like set me up to be a scholar of religion. So the kind of art that I did, I learned it was not just art to create these beautiful pictures. It was actually art to train my mind and body to see what was in front of me. And I spent a lot of time in the forest because we had a very beautiful forest and basically a park, multi-acre park, maybe like even miles long,
wow,
next to our house. Yeah, it was really beautiful.
That's a dream for a kid.
Yeah, I know it was.
Oh my God. Sorry, I interrupted.
Not kids these days, though.
No, the parks are virtual.
Yeah.
Yes. I always have a difficulty. It's funny. Every time I'm asked what I think creativity is, every time I'm asked, my answer changes. And but it changes on my mood. It changes. It reflects the energy of the conversation I'm already having with the person. But I've recently come to terms with that because I still don't know. But it is an ever-changing thing, I think. But what doesn't change, so you tell me your thoughts. What doesn't change is that there's a specific feeling when you're in the flow with something, that time doesn't matter. Like the time doesn't, like you are away from any kind of three-dimensional definition of existence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it not only makes sense. I think a lot of people actually know this. Okay, so here's an example. So just the other day, I was writing one of the last chapters for my book, and it kind of ends on the Fibonacci sequence type thing, right? So I'm talking about the Fibonacci sequence as kind of a discovery of something that's already there, and indigenous people knew about it way before Fibonacci did. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. My son is applying to colleges, and he's just finished his essay. Now, I just finished my book. He just finished his essay. He comes in and he says, I just finished my essay. And I was like, wow, that's a great coincidence. I just finished the last chapter of my book. And so we all kind of, this kind of hand high five. Yeah. Yeah.
You said that like a mother. You said that like a mother. Like even the hand, you couldn't find the word. Sorry, go ahead.
I know, it's so bad. And so I asked him if I could read it, and he said, sure. So he put it down, and I noticed that he talked about the Fibonacci. It's, he's a computer programmer. He's interested in doing computer programming. And so he talks about the Fibonacci sequence. I said, oh, how weird. I just wrote about that. Now, he doesn't believe me. He says, come on. And I said, no, it's true. So I opened my computer and I showed it to him. And he said, wow, that's really strange. And I said, yeah, it is really strange. And his essay was excellent. So I said, this is such an excellent essay. And then I thought, what was it? And by the way, I had the topic of that chapter I'd written about was creativity. And so I said to him, what was the prompt for this essay, by the way? Because, a lot of university applications give you a prompt. And he read it out to me, and this is what it was. Describe a time when you actually lost sense of time. What were you doing? Yeah. They were basically trying to identify which kids were creative.
And that's a beautiful question. That's a beautiful question to ask kids.
Yeah. And he came up with this really cool story about the time when he wanted to code, but he failed miserably at it. But during the time he did it, he lost sense of time.
Oh, yeah.
And so that reminds me of what you just said. Creativity is this idea. So yes, I do believe that's what it is. It's this time we enter a state of timelessness. And some people call it a flow state.
Yeah. And I think I used the word flow as well earlier. I think it's more than that. Timelessness, I think.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Well, let me tell you some more because I did a lot of research for this. So, and gosh, I will give you the name of the researcher whose work I utilize, but I can't remember it right now.
We'll put it in the show notes. It's okay.
Okay, yeah. And your listeners can then, follow up about her work. But she does work on creativity, and she found that she's a neuroscientist, that when people are in these flow states and they're extremely creative, okay, that the frontal cortex shuts down so that they do not associate what they're creating with themselves. They think that it's an external agent that's actually doing this. Now, is there an external agent? A lot of people say, yes, it was Lakshmi, the goddess, that would be Ramanujan, right? Who was the mathematician. He'd say the goddess Lakshmi would whisper in my ear, and I would create these, I would discover these math equations, which, by the way, people are still figuring out today. And Tyler called it off-planet intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. And James said that he would go to this place and get this information and bring it back. So they all had their external agents. And so I think that, I don't know what's going on, frankly, but I don't think she does either, but she's able to identify the parts of the brain that are engaged.
So do you feel like you had external agents helping you writing the book?
Oh, yeah, I did. I did have external agents in many times in my life, I felt, but I never identified them as external agents. I never said Lakshmi did this, or I just felt really good doing it. And I felt like if I could get into that state again, I would do it again. Like that's the kind of, it gives you a lot of energy to be in that state. It's magical. And sometimes I would be in that state with people. So I do believe that in sports events, people actually can get into those states and I think that that's why sports is so important to so many people, is because they're naturally outside of their own egos and outside of their own, consciousness, and working together as a unit. And it's a peak experience.
I would agree. There's a sense of communion without understanding that there's communion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also music. And I've had friends of mine who are professors talk about doing improv, because they said that improv is also like that.
We've just started discussions with one of the owners of a large, I don't want to say the name of the company, but they're a franchise of the comedy outlets and comedy events, because we want to discover that with them.
Yeah. So listen, and you know what computer programmers call it today? There's a new word for it that they use. They call it emergence.
You mentioned this. Tell me. Yeah.
So when they can't figure out how their neural network systems work, they say it's emergent. And I'm like, that means you don't know what you're doing. You do not know the order of operations that leads to this outcome. That's what that means.
I should ask Ryan
properties.
I should ask Ryan Graves, the naval pilot, because he has a new podcast called Merged, and there is lingo in military about merging with your enemy, with your opponent, or whatever. But it's a double entendre.
Of course.
I want to ask him. What do you believe about how you exist after your body passes away?
Okay, so I don't know, but I mean, obviously I don't. As a professor, I would have to say that I don't know. Okay. Um, as a person, right, who's not a professor, so I'm speaking off the record as any kind of professor, has nothing to do with my department or my university or my field.
Just Diana.
Yeah. So my personal belief, I'm Catholic, and I believe that I have a soul, and we all have souls, and that's what I believe. And also, I'm not exclusionary Catholic. So I believe that a Buddhist I know Buddhists who are better Catholics than Catholics, and and their souls are good souls, right? My mother is Jewish, and I grew up with a father who's Catholic and a mother who's Jewish, and she has a beautiful soul. So I'm not an exclusionary Catholic who believes that that's the only way to, but I'm a practicing Catholic. So I do practice.
So thank you for
Catholic.
Sorry, say that again.
You're supposed to believe these things, right? And I would have to say I'm agnostic, really. I'm at least truthful.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's all I ask from you. But what it is that you feel exists, or how you exist, it's so fascinating. The answers that I receive from people when I ask them. We don't ask everybody, but I like to. We had a few near-death experiencers on the podcast, and the first one that we had, his name is Tony Chicoria, and he was a surgeon. I don't know if you know his story. I've said it.
I read near-death experiences a lot.
Oh, okay.
That's what led me to write a book about purgatory.
I didn't know that. I didn't know.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So if you haven't listened to his story, his and Natalie Sudman, who's also on the podcast, amazing stories. Because it was a kind of a brief not brief. Actually, it's not brief. Let's strike that word. It's been a hobby of mine just to listen to these stories. But he got hit by lightning. Short story. Hit by lightning. Realized his body went back, but he felt propelled forward, and he didn't realize that he had left his body until he saw his mother-in-law scream and run past him, and he looked back and he saw his body. So he gave whole explanation on what he turned into, what he was feeling, what he was seeing, where he was going, and he didn't want to leave that state. And as a human being listening to this, I felt enthralled. As a lapsed Catholic, I felt like I was believing him, because that's what I grew up with that doctrine too. They kind of merged. But again, fascinating. So he came back. He was actually brought to life by an emergency room nurse who happened to be waiting behind him, waiting to use the phone.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was upset by it. He didn't want to be saved.
Right.
But we talked about how this conflicted with his religious upbringing, and the religious upbringing of people related to him who didn't. There were those that were open and trying to understand and put pieces together in their own life about his story and what they believed, and then there were others who were very rigid about it and didn't want to hear it because it was false, it was heretic, and so forth. I just like to listen to these things and read about them so that I can, like, I want to be the octopus. Like,
you want to know. Yeah.
I just want to know. Just want to know.
If I could say something about near-death experiences. Yeah. So throughout my time as a professor, I've had many, many young people, students, tell me about their near-death experiences. I actually worked with a student for 3 years before he actually told me that he had died and was brought back to life. Wow. And I said, you never told me this. Why not? And he said, I don't know why not. He goes, there was a time for me to tell you, and this was the time. And he had not been brought up in any religious tradition, and many of them hadn't actually. So yeah, I have a lot of data about that, and I'm just fascinated with it myself. And let me think about this. So just recently, I came across the work of a father. I think his name is Tiso, Tiso. He's a Jesuit who spent time with Tibetan Buddhists in Nepal. And he has done a lot of research into what's called the rainbow body. And you should have him on your podcast.
Cool.
He's fascinating. Yeah. So the rainbow body is a state of a disintegration of your physical body when you die and the creation of an astral body that can be seen by others.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
Is he American? Father Tiso?
Yeah, he's American Jesuit. Yes.
Okay. We'll look that up. Just as an FYI to you, our listeners will know this. 3 weeks ago, we released an episode with Father Nathan Castle. Have you heard of him?
I have heard of him.
From Arizona, and he helps what he calls stuck souls.
That's right. Yeah.
They reach out to him during his dreams, and then they set up an appointment. So he channels them. He channels them, and he has a prayer group. And they go over, they counsel what the soul's issue is about not crossing over, like not fully crossing over. Mm-hmm. Really, I mean, he's a gentleman. He's a Texan gentleman, but great conversation. Like I learned a little bit about what trade he's plying on the side.
Right, fascinating.
It's so I'll save this to the end. I have one more question for you. I thank you so much for your time. You've been awesome. This is really
absolutely.
So last question. What does greatness mean to you?
Greatness would be something that I would attribute to the creation, to the Grand Canyon or something like that. Something like when you're up in the mountains, like the Sierra Nevadas, and you look up and you can see the spokes of the Milky Way. To me, that's greatness.
I can see why you're friends with Brother Guy Consolmagno. I'll leave it off with something from what I learned about getting to know you a little bit and reading your material. And it's 4 words. And you quote it was a German philosopher, Heidegger. It's Heidegger, right?
Yep.
4 words. I think we can adopt this for the podcast because they're so beautiful. Questioning builds a way.
Yes. I love that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Diana.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.